Hello, everybody. In this episode, I'm releasing a bonus episode that I put together last year over on the bonus feed at patreon.com/reflectinghistory. I think we're up to about 20 bonus episodes or so now. So if you're interested in supporting the podcast, you can head over there. There's a link in the show notes. You can get access to bonus episodes, a monthly recommendations thing that I kind of put together every month, behind the scenes type of stuff related to the podcast, and a couple of other perks here and there. It's just a way to support the podcast if you feel like doing so. Again, that's at patreon.com/reflectinghistory. Another way to support the podcast is by checking out the audio course, Nazi Germany and the Battle for the Human Heart. It's about the rise of Hitler, the rise of the Nazi Party, and it tries to analyze the extent to which ordinary people like you and I played a role in the rise of fascism. It's 13 episodes long. 20% of the proceeds that I get from the course go to GiveWell's Maximum Impact Fund. So hopefully, in addition to learning something cool about history, also the course is hopefully helping people who need it. You can find the course at avid.fm/reflectinghistory. And just like with Patreon, there's also a link in the show notes if you want to click through it that way. And if you don't feel like supporting the podcast in either of those ways, there's plenty of other ways to do so. Just listening, subscribing, telling a friend, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you're listening to on. All of that stuff is very helpful, and I am very appreciative of everybody who is listening and enjoying the podcast. It really means a lot. All right. So now that the biannual podcast support plug is done, on to the bonus episode here. This bonus episode is about a short story called The Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu. If you're going to listen to the episode, I do recommend you read the story. There's a link to it in the show notes. And actually, even if you don't listen to the episode, I still recommend that you read the story. It's that good. It's one of my favorites. I don't know anyone who's read this story who doesn't love it. And as many of us gear up for Mother's Day weekend here, I think it has that much extra meaning. So yeah, as always, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the episode. I've always felt that regret is an interesting emotion. In a lot of ways, regret is more than just an emotion. Regret is a memory. It's not the same as anger or maybe some other emotions that are a little bit more automated, stimulus and response. Somebody cuts you off in traffic, boom, you immediately feel angry. But regret, on the other hand, requires this cognitive state of looking back at things, sifting through memories, and maybe second guessing or wishing things might have turned out differently. And I think this act of active cognition, when combined with the emotional part of it, makes regret especially powerful among emotions. Why do we do the things that we do? Why don't we appreciate what we have in the moment? Sometimes, even when we know what we should do, we still don't do it. I think we've all been there where we are doing things or behaving a certain way, and even in the moment, we're wondering, what are we doing? And of course, that feeling gets magnified as we look back in time and as the regret continues to grow over time. And it's not just going to affect us, and it's not just going to lead to negative cognitive states like resentment or shame, but it's also going to lead to resentment and other negative impacts for the people around us. This black hole of regret is powerful and it can destroy lives. Ken Liu's amazing short story called The Paper Menagerie looks at regret. It's about regret and why we feel it, and ultimately how we overcome it. But to say that The Paper Menagerie is just about one thing kind of cheapens the story, because it's about so many things. It's part cautionary tale, it's part inspirational tale, it's about the power of imagination and nostalgia, it's about memory and regret, shame, culture and tradition, family, history, and ultimately love. It's not a super long story, so I recommend that you give it a read before we begin discussing it. The story of The Paper Menagerie is told by a character named Jack, who's looking back at his childhood with his mom and his dad. Jack's father, I don't think it ever explicitly says, but I believe he's white, an American living in Connecticut, and his mother is a mail-order bride from China. The concept of a mail-order bride probably, I think, had its heyday before the advent of online dating, but the concept was basically that these marriage agencies could sort of put out advertisements or magazines that would allow people to get into contact and set up agreements that would ultimately lead to meeting and then marriage. Certainly, this whole system of the way that works is and was controversial, and it certainly comes with a stigma, and you can also see there's plenty of places where logistically and ethically things could go bad pretty quickly. But let's set all that aside for now. We'll come back to it. Ultimately, Jack's mother comes over from China via Hong Kong, lives in Connecticut with his dad, and they have Jack together, a mixed-race child with Chinese heritage. So with that context out of the way, the centerpiece of the story is this paper menagerie that Jack's mother makes for him. She's able to take old wrapping paper and through her origami skills is able to turn it into these paper animals that then come to life. Jack, of course, being a kid at the beginning of the story, loves to play with the paper menagerie, especially the tiger, who he names Lao Hu. And again, what kid wouldn't enjoy that? Imagine Toy Story, but the toys are actually alive when you're playing with them. But the story really kicks off when Jack is remembering his thoughts as he got older, as he transitioned from childhood into young adulthood. And over the course of time, instead of loving to play with his paper menagerie, he begins to resent it. And in the same way, he begins to resent his mother. He is embarrassed by her lack of an ability to speak English. He's shamed by the fact that they don't eat enough American food. He feels like she's an embarrassment because she hasn't assimilated fully enough into American society. A lot of times it seems like his anger and his hate is generated not necessarily from inside of the family dynamics, but from those around him. and the environment around him and situations that he really doesn't have a lot of control over. He remembers as a kid moving to a new house and meeting two of his neighbors and discriminatory remarks about Chinese people and Asian American heritage and mixed race marriages and children in general. Jack remembers the neighbors talking about his dad and him. They say, quote, "He seems like a normal enough man. Why did he do that? Something about the mixing never seems right. The child looks unfinished. Slanty eyes, white face. A little monster." End quote. In another example, Jack brings his friend Mark over to play. Mark brings his toy Obi-Wan Kenobi action figure, and Jack goes and gets Lao Hu, his paper tiger, and he shows Mark. Mark is not impressed, basically calling the tiger kind of what it is, a piece of trash in the shape of a tiger. Jack, of course, gets upset. Lao Hu, the tiger, attacks Mark, and then Mark crumples it up and rips it in half and throws it back in Jack's face. And this fight between Jack and Mark seems to be a turning point where now Jack's feeling of inadequacy is going to lead him to reject his Chinese heritage, and he's going to reject his mother as a result, and things between them would never be the same. Jack takes all of his paper toys that are alive, he deflates them and crumples them up, he puts them in a box, and he puts them in the attic where he never really looks at them again. In the same way that his relationship with his mother is now cracked and torn and deflated, the Paper Menagerie is also deflated and its magic is lost. Now, as you're reading about the Paper Menagerie, you can't help but wonder, was it actually real? Were these toys really alive and running around the living room? And was it really the paper tiger that attacked Mark when Jack felt insulted? Or was it actually Jack attacking Mark and then sort of ascribing his actions to the Paper Menagerie? This question of whether the menagerie was actually alive or not is something that, as the reader, is in the back of your head as you're reading the story. Jack certainly has his doubts as he gets older during the story, and here he describes the menagerie as its power is lost, and also how that relationship with the menagerie is tied to the relationship with his mom that he seems to also have lost. He says, quote, "Every once in a while, I would see her at the kitchen table studying the plain side of a sheet of wrapping paper. Later, a new paper animal would appear on my nightstand and try to cuddle up to me. I caught them, squeezed them until the air went out of them, and then stuffed them away in the box in the attic. Mom finally stopped making the animals when I was in high school. By then, her English was much better, but I was already at that age when I wasn't interested in what she had to say, whatever language she used. Sometimes, when I came home and saw her tiny body busily moving about in the kitchen, singing a song in Chinese to herself, it was hard for me to believe that she gave birth to me. We had nothing in common. She might as well be from the moon. I would hurry on to my room, where I could continue my all-American pursuit of happiness." End quote. As Jack gets even older, he continues his pursuit of the American dream. There's an interesting segment where he talks about selling himself to a corporation, basically interviewing and trying to get a job. And you can't really tell if he's making that comparison ironically, perhaps seeing the connections between him selling himself in a corporate American way versus his mother's situation with the mail order bride. You also wonder about the dad during this part of Jack's life. Could he have done more? Could he have been better? Was he enabling Jack's behavior towards his mother by pressuring the mother to, quote unquote, fit into American society and assimilate instead of maybe embracing her culture, accepting it, and going from there? These are all interesting questions to think about, not just from the perspective of Jack and his mother and father, but also from a broader American immigration perspective. There's a great moment in one of the first lines of the story that foreshadows the dad's behavior in a way, when Jack talks about how he was crying and having a fit early on in his life, and he remembers his mom basically helping him by making the Paper Menagerie, but long before that help came from his mother, his dad gave up. And you see that behavior from the dad in several instances throughout the story, this idea of sort of giving up and maybe not doing as much as he could have done. Eventually, Jack's mom dies, probably of cancer of some sort. And even in the hospital, as Jack is at her deathbed, he's unable to really make any connection with his mother. The bonds of connection and relationship had been broken for too long. The rejection of his identity and his tradition and his culture, and his rejection of her identity and tradition and culture, was too ingrained. After his mother's death, Jack finds himself in his dad's house once again, helping him move out when he encounters the Paper Menagerie after so many years. He says, quote, "The paper animals did not move. Perhaps whatever magic had animated them stopped when Mom died. Or perhaps I had only imagined that these paper constructions were once alive. The memory of children could not be trusted." End quote. Again, as the reader, we're being forced to question the truth of the Paper Menagerie, in the same way that Jack is doubting if it was ever real. Maybe he just made up the fact that the animals were moving around because that's what kids' imaginations do. We, as the readers, are wondering that same thing. Was the menagerie ever really alive, or was it always dead, just like the relationship between Jack and his mother? At the end of the story, Jack is sitting in his house watching TV when suddenly something he sees on TV reminds him of his mother. And then he hears some rustling of paper, and he looks over to see Lao Hu, the paper tiger that was his favorite when he was a kid. Jack's wife had put the Paper Menagerie animals out in different places around his house, and for the first time, maybe in years, Jack goes up to investigate the paper tiger. The tiger jumps into his hands and unfolds to reveal a letter written from Jack's mom to Jack. And finally, the truth of the menagerie and its meaning is revealed through the contents of the letter, which turns out to be his mother's story that he never got to hear, and really that he never wanted or cared to hear about. Reading the letter makes you really feel the pain and the shame that Jack's mother was feeling as a result of his mistreatment of her. It also reminds you of an earlier exchange in the story where Jack was having sort of a shouting match with his mom and dad, where he was demanding that his mother speak English and that they cook American food. And he even says he wants real American toys, not the Paper Menagerie. The mother tries to explain that to really truly express herself and the way that she truly feels and is, she has to speak Chinese and she has to embrace her culture and her heritage. Otherwise, it's not the full experience of her. She says, quote, "If I say love, I feel here." She pointed to her lips. "If I say I feel here." She put her hand over her heart. Jack, now narrating, says that Dad shook his head. "You are in America." Mom hunched down in her seat, looking like the water buffalo when Lao Hu used to pounce on him and squeeze the air of life out of him. End quote. All of this time, the Paper Menagerie was an attempt by Jack's mother to create that bond with him. As she continually tries to make more animals and give them to Jack and have them love Jack, Jack continues to reject them, and the mother feels just like the paper animals who are now deflated and without life. So Jack's mom eventually decides to write a letter inside of Lao Hu, the paper tiger. She writes it in Chinese because, similar to that quote we had earlier, and the concept of I love coming from the heart, she can only express herself truly in her native language. Jack has to have someone translate the letter to him, and the contents of the letter change his view of his mom, his view of himself, and really his outlook on life. And how could it not? At one point, the mom explains the Paper Menagerie by saying, quote, "The animals will stop moving when I stop breathing. But if I write to you with all my heart, I'll leave a little of myself behind on this paper, in these words. Then, if you think of me on Qingming, when the spirits of the departed are allowed to visit their families, you'll make the parts of myself I leave behind come alive too. The creatures I made for you will again leap and run and pounce, and maybe you'll get to see these words then. Because I have to write with all my heart, I need to write to you in Chinese. All this time, I haven't told you the story of my life. When you were little, I always thought I'd tell you the story when you were older, so you could understand. But somehow that chance never came up." End quote. Jack's mother goes on to explain how she was born in China in 1957. The Great Leap Forward was initiated by Mao Zedong in 1958. Anyone who's listened to older episodes of this podcast will know that the Great Leap Forward was a disaster for China, leading to tens of millions of deaths, famine, and chaos. And this was the environment that Jack's mother grew up in. A few years later, the Cultural Revolution would hit China, and it was discovered that Jack's mother had a relative in Hong Kong who was a merchant. Naturally, this would lead the Communist Party and the Red Guards and the fervor of the Cultural Revolution to go after Jack's mom's family. As traitors to the people, they needed to be punished. Her mom ended up committing suicide because she couldn't deal with the persecution. Her dad was murdered. And as a 10-year-old kid, Jack's mom got on a train trying to get to safety, get to Hong Kong. On the way there, she was captured by what were probably some sort of slave traders. She becomes some version of a household slave where she's locked in a cupboard, can only emerge at certain times, has to do household chores and cook and clean, these types of things. Eventually, she's discovered by a woman who offers her an opportunity in the form of this mail order bride marriage agency. She takes it. That's how she ends up in the catalog that Jack's father found her in, and ultimately that's how she gets to safety and gets to America. You can't help but remember earlier in the story, one of the reasons Jack resents his mom is because she was a mail order bride, and his classmates make fun of him for this. Earlier in the story, he said, quote, "What kind of woman puts herself into a catalog so that she can be bought? The high school me thought I knew so much about everything. Contempt felt good, like wine." End quote. As Jack is having this letter read to him, surely he's feeling the regret and the stupidity of his youth. He's learning the truth about his mother and how she felt about him. And he's learning the truth about the Paper Menagerie and that it was alive. As readers, we're learning the meaning of the Paper Menagerie and how it is associated with love and Jack's mother and Chinese culture and the importance of family and tradition, and how his mother was trying to make these things come alive inside of Jack, and ultimately how that Paper Menagerie is a vessel for the bond between a mom and her son. Another concept to point out is the way in which the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution impacted Jack's mom. In this case, the scars of the past never really healed. And as we've talked about before, events in history are never really over. There's always going to be this ripple effect, this butterfly effect as people move on from events in history, but they are continually affected by them. Sometimes even trying to separate history into different events is in some ways a fool's errand. Nothing's over. Nothing really ends. The outcomes and the pain and the scars of an event like the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution travel from person to person, generation to generation. Jack's mom talks about this a little bit when she concludes her letter that she knows her son will only read long after she's gone. She says, quote, "In the suburbs of Connecticut, I was lonely. Your father was kind and gentle with me, and I was very grateful to him. But no one understood me, and I understood nothing. But then you were born. I was so happy when I looked into your face and saw shades of my mother, my father, and myself. I had lost my entire family, everything I ever knew and loved. But there you were, and your face was proof that they were real. I hadn't made them up. Now I had someone to talk to. I would teach you my language, and we could together remake a small piece of everything that I loved and lost. When you said your first words to me in Chinese, that had the same accent as my mother and me, I cried for hours. When I made the first Jeji animals for you and you laughed, I felt there were no worries in the world. You grew up a little, and now you could even help your father and I talk to each other. I was really at home now. I finally found a good life. I wished my parents could be here so that I could cook for them and give them a good life too. But my parents were no longer around. You know what the Chinese think is the saddest feeling in the world? It's for a child to finally grow the desire to take care of his parents, only to realize that they were long gone. Son, I know that you do not like your Chinese eyes, which are my eyes. I know that you do not like your Chinese hair, which is my hair. But can you understand how much joy your very existence brought to me? And can you understand how it felt when you stopped talking to me and won't let me talk to you in Chinese, I felt I was losing everything all over again. Why won't you talk to me, son? The pain makes it hard to write." End quote. There's so much in a passage like that, and as emotional as it is, it's going to hit everybody differently, and people are going to take away different themes and interpretations from a story like this. But just a couple things to point out from the ending of that letter. Jack's mom talks about how the traumas and the pain and the death and the suffering that she went through during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution began to feel as if they weren't real. She says that when Jack was born, his face was quote-unquote proof that she hadn't made up all of the horrible things that happened to her. Over the course of the years, you can't blame her if Jack and her husband continuously shunned her family identity and her culture and her tradition and her history and never really accepted it and allowed her to express herself in it. Their behavior towards her leads her to question if what happened in her childhood was really true. What's really brilliant here is that, to me at least, this mirrors how Jack, earlier in the story, was questioning whether his paper menagerie was real and alive. Both the mother and the son were having the same crisis of identity at the same time, but they weren't able to cement that bond that should have been cemented. But at the end of the story, after Jack read the letter, he walks away and Lao Hu is intact and purring, and everything in Jack's life is intact again as a result of reading his mother's letter. That bond between mother and son, while it was fractured and damaged over the course of years, it never broke. And although regretfully it is in her death, that bond is able to be restored at the end of the story. So the ending is bitter, but it is bittersweet in that way because Jack's bond with his mother is restored. It's also interesting that throughout the story, Jack, looking back as a kid, is talking about how the paper menagerie is constantly being damaged, whether it's watermarks or tears or people crumpling up and tearing in half the toys. They always seem to come back. And to me, that relates back to this idea that relationships are constantly being damaged, and your identity and cultural history and tradition are oftentimes being damaged. And this is always happening throughout life. But there's always room for forgiveness. And some bonds can't be broken, won't be broken. Those bonds may be strained and they may have scars that will always show, but they never end. It's never over. History does matter. Tradition does matter. Identity and culture, imagination, all those things we listed in the beginning of the episode do matter. And maybe it's love that connects all of those themes together. In this case, a mother's love for her son. Remember that it was her dying wish on her hospital bed that he open up the paper menagerie one more time and discover her story. In the same way that at the very beginning of the story, when the mother saves Jack from trauma and crying by making the paper menagerie for him in the first place, at the end of the story, the paper menagerie and Jack's mother's relationship with Jack saves him once again.